Sarah Chen walked into the upscale restaurant with quiet confidence, her simple black dress and minimal makeup drawing dismissive glances from the hostess. The young woman behind the podium looked her up and down with barely concealed disdain, taking in Sarah's practical flats and modest handbag. "Do you have a reservation?" the hostess asked, her tone suggesting she doubted someone like Sarah could afford to eat there. "Yes, under Chen, party of 4, Sarah replied calmly, used to such treatment. The hostess scrolled through her tablet with exaggerated slowness. "I don't see anything here. Are you sure you made a reservation at the right place? There's a diner down the street that might be more suitable." Sarah maintained her composure, pulling out her phone to show the confirmation email. The hostess barely glanced at it before sighing dramatically. "Well, I suppose I can squeeze you in, but you'll have to wait. The table isn't ready yet." As Sarah stood waiting, she noticed other customers who arrived after her being seated immediately. A well-dressed couple swept past her to a prime table by the window, the same hostess suddenly all smiles and courtesy. Sarah checked her watch. Her colleagues from the law firm would arrive soon for their celebration dinner. "Excuse me," Sarah said politely after 20 minutes had passed. "Could you check on my table? My guest will be here shortly." The hostess rolled her eyes. "Look, this is a high-end establishment. Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere that matches your budget. I'm just trying to save you from embarrassment when the bill comes." Other diners began to stare, some whispering among themselves. Sarah felt the familiar sting of judgment she'd experienced countless times throughout her life. People saw her unremarkable appearance, her quiet demeanor, and immediately made assumptions. They saw someone to overlook, to dismiss, to treat as less than. "I understand your concern," Sarah said evenly, "but I assure you I can handle the bill. I've been looking forward to dining here with my colleagues." The hostess smirked. "Colleagues? What kind of work do you do? Let me guess, you're someone's assistant?" Before Sarah could answer, a sharply dressed man approached the hostess station. His expensive suit and confident bearing immediately changed the hostess's demeanor. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, looking between Sarah and the increasingly flustered hostess. "No problem at all, sir," the hostess replied quickly. "I was just explaining to this person that we're fully booked tonight." The man frowned. "But I just saw you seat 3 parties who arrived after I did. What's really going on here?" Sarah appreciated the stranger's intervention but remained silent, knowing that speaking up might only make things worse. She'd learned long ago that causing a scene rarely worked in her favor. People were more likely to side with the polished hostess than with someone like her. The restaurant manager appeared, drawn by the commotion. He was a thin man with a nervous energy who immediately sized up the situation. His eyes lingered on Sarah's modest appearance before turning to the well-dressed man with obvious relief. "I apologize for any confusion," the manager said smoothly. "How can I assist you this evening?" "This woman has been waiting for nearly half an hour with a confirmed reservation, while others are seated immediately," the man explained. "Your hostess seems to think she doesn't belong here." The manager's smile faltered slightly as he looked at Sarah again. "I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding. What name was the reservation under?" Sarah showed him the confirmation on her phone once more. The manager studied it carefully, clearly hoping to find some reason to turn her away. When he couldn't, his expression grew resigned. "Of course. Miss Chen, right this way." His tone was professionally polite but cold. As they walked through the dining room, Sarah noticed the subtle signs of judgment from other patrons. Raised eyebrows, whispered comments, curious stares. She'd grown accustomed to being underestimated, but it never stopped hurting. In boardrooms, at social events, even in casual encounters, people consistently viewed her as insignificant. The hostess followed behind them, her earlier rudeness replaced by nervous energy. She clearly regretted her behavior now that the manager was involved, but the damage was done. Sarah had heard every dismissive word, felt every condescending look. The table they were given was in the back corner, partially hidden by a support column. Sarah noticed immediately. It was clearly the worst table in the restaurant, the kind reserved for customers they hoped would eat quickly and leave. But she said nothing, taking her seat with the same quiet dignity she'd maintained throughout the ordeal. "Your server will be right with you," the manager said curtly, before walking away. Sarah sat alone at the poorly positioned table, watching the bustling restaurant around her. She thought about her colleagues who would arrive soon, successful lawyers who commanded respect wherever they went. They would be shocked by the treatment she'd received, but not entirely surprised. Sarah had always been the quiet one, the one who blended into the background. The server who approached her table was young and harried, clearly new to the job. "Can I start you with something to drink?" she asked, her tone suggesting she expected a water order and nothing more. "I'll wait for my party to arrive," Sarah replied. "They should be here shortly." The server nodded and hurried away, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts. She reflected on the countless similar experiences she'd endured throughout her life. Teachers who'd overlooked her in school, employers who'd underestimated her capabilities, strangers who'd made snap judgments based on her appearance. What none of them knew was the strength that lay beneath her unremarkable exterior, the experiences that had forged her character in ways they could never imagine. The commitment to service and sacrifice that had shaped her into the woman she was today. Sarah adjusted her dress slightly, feeling the familiar presence beneath the fabric. Soon her colleagues would arrive and the evening would progress. But for now, she sat quietly, letting the judgment and dismissal wash over her as she'd learned to do so many times before. The restaurant continued to buzz around her, staff and customers alike having already dismissed her as unimportant. They had no idea who was sitting in their midst, what she had done, or what she was capable of. To them, she was just another unremarkable woman taking up space. Sarah smiled slightly to herself. If they only knew the truth, their attitudes would change in an instant. But that revelation would come later, when the moment was right. 20 minutes later, 3 figures in expensive suits entered the restaurant, immediately commanding attention. The same hostess who had dismissed Sarah now practically glowed with enthusiasm as she greeted them. These were clearly important people, the kind of clients the restaurant valued. "Good evening. Welcome to Meridian. How can I help you tonight?" Her voice was honey-sweet, a stark contrast to the cold treatment Sarah had received. "We're meeting our colleague," said Marcus Rivera, the lead partner at Chen & Associates law firm. "The reservation should be under Chen." The hostess's face went pale. She glanced nervously toward the back corner where she'd reluctantly seated Sarah, then back at these obviously successful individuals. "Chen, you mean—" "You're with the woman we seated earlier?" "Sarah Chen, yes," confirmed Jennifer Walsh, another partner. "She's our founding partner and one of the most respected attorneys in the city." The hostess's hand flew to her mouth as the reality of her mistake hit her. The woman she'd dismissed as unworthy was not only the person these important people were meeting, she was their boss. The founding partner of a prestigious law firm that handled million-dollar cases. "Oh my God," she whispered, her face turning crimson. I didn't realize," Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Didn't realize what?" Before the hostess could answer, the manager appeared, sensing trouble. He'd overheard enough of the conversation to understand that a significant error had been made. His own face drained of color as he processed the implications. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding," the manager said quickly. "Please let me personally escort you to your table." As they walked through the restaurant, Jennifer noticed their destination. "That's quite a secluded table for a celebration dinner," she observed coolly. "Is this really the best you could do for a party of 4? The manager's hands began to shake slightly. These people clearly had influence and money, exactly the kind of customers who could destroy a restaurant's reputation with a few well-placed reviews or words. To the right people. When they reached the corner table, Sarah looked up with a genuine smile as her colleagues approached. She'd been watching the hostess's changing expressions from across the room and could guess what had transpired. "Sarah," Jennifer exclaimed, leaning down to embrace her. "Congratulations on the Morrison case settlement. $12 million, absolutely brilliant work." "Thank you," Sarah replied warmly. It was a team effort, as always. David Thompson, the third partner, shook his head in amazement. "Modest as ever. You single-handedly took on Morrison Industries and their army of lawyers, and made them pay for 20 years of environmental damage." The manager stood frozen beside their table, finally understanding the magnitude of his staff's error. Sarah Chen wasn't just any customer. She was a legal powerhouse whose cases made headlines. Her environmental law work had shut down corrupt corporations and won justice for countless victims. "Is everything satisfactory?" the manager asked nervously, his voice barely steady. Marcus looked around the cramped corner spot with obvious displeasure. "This table is completely unacceptable for a business dinner. The lighting is poor, It's too close to the kitchen, and frankly, it's insulting. We can certainly move you to a better location, the manager offered quickly, sweat beading on his forehead. Sarah raised a gentle hand. That's not necessary. We're here to celebrate, not to make a fuss. But Jennifer wasn't ready to let it go. Sarah, what exactly happened when you arrived? You've been here for almost an hour. Sarah's colleagues knew her well enough to read between the lines. They'd seen how people often underestimated her based on her quiet demeanor and unassuming appearance. It was a constant source of frustration for them, watching someone so accomplished be dismissed by those who couldn't see past the surface. It was just a small mix-up with the reservation, Sarah said diplomatically, always preferring to avoid confrontation. The hostess, who had been hovering nearby, couldn't contain herself any longer. I'm so sorry, Ms. Chen. I didn't know who you were. I assumed. You assumed what? David's voice had an edge that made several nearby diners turn to look. The young woman's eyes filled with tears. I thought she was just ordinary. I didn't think someone like her could afford to eat here. I suggested she try the diner down the street instead. The silence that followed was deafening. Other patrons, realizing something significant was happening, had stopped their conversations to listen. The manager looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. Marcus's expression grew thunderous. You suggested that one of the city's most accomplished attorneys, who has appeared on the cover of Legal Monthly 3 times, should eat at a diner because she doesn't look wealthy enough for your establishment? I'll understand if you want to leave, the manager said quickly. Your meal tonight will be completely complimentary, of course, and I'll personally ensure this never happens again. Sarah studied the terrified faces around her. The hostess who was now crying openly. The manager who clearly feared for his job. The server who had been standoffish earlier and was now wringing her hands anxiously. What's your name? Sarah asked the hostess gently. Emma, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Emma, how long have you worked here? 3 months. This is my first job out of college, Sarah nodded thoughtfully. She could have destroyed this young woman's career with a few words. A complaint to management, a negative review mentioning the hostess by name, or even just allowing her colleagues to express their full outrage would have immediate consequences. Do you think you learned something tonight, Emma? Sarah asked. The hostess nodded vigorously, tears streaming down her face. Yes, ma'am. I'm so sorry. I was completely wrong to judge you. I know that now. Jennifer leaned forward, her lawyer instincts in full force. Sarah, this isn't just about one employee's mistake. This is about systemic bias and discrimination. You shouldn't have to educate people about basic respect. The manager wrung his hands. Please, we'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Ms. Chen, your reputation precedes you. Everyone in the city knows about your work. There's no excuse for how you were treated. Sarah looked around the table at her colleagues, then at the restaurant staff who had gathered nearby. She could feel the weight of the moment, the opportunity to make a statement that would resonate far beyond this single evening. The conversation was drawing attention from other diners, some of whom were beginning to recognize her name. Word was spreading through the restaurant that someone important was at the corner table, someone who had been badly mistreated by the staff. Sarah's response surprised everyone. Instead of anger or demands for apologies, she turned to Emma with genuine curiosity. Tell me about yourself, Emma. What did you study in college? The hostess wiped her eyes, confused by the gentle tone. I studied hospitality management. I wanted to work in restaurants because I love meeting people and making them feel welcome. And how do you think you did tonight with that goal? Sarah asked quietly. Emma's face crumpled again. Terrible. I failed completely. I made you feel unwelcome instead of greeting you properly. I judged you based on your appearance, and that's exactly what they taught us never to do in school. Marcus and Jennifer exchanged glances, recognizing Sarah's teaching approach. She often did this in the courtroom, using questions to help people understand their mistakes rather than simply punishing them. What assumptions did you make about me? Sarah continued. I thought you couldn't afford to eat here. I thought you weren't important enough for this restaurant. I thought you were probably someone's assistant or maybe unemployed. Emma's voice grew smaller with each admission. David leaned back in his chair, watching Sarah work. He'd seen her use this same technique with opposing lawyers, leading them to understand the flaws in their arguments through careful questioning rather than aggressive attacks. And what do you know about me now? Sarah asked. You're a successful lawyer. You're a founding partner. You've won important cases. Emma paused, then added quietly, and you're being much kinder to me than I deserve. Sarah nodded. Those are the facts about my career. But what about as a person? What have you learned about who I am? The question made Emma think deeper. You're patient. You're not cruel even when someone treats you badly. You're trying to help me learn instead of just getting me fired. The manager shifted nervously, unsure where this conversation was heading. Other restaurants would have already demanded the employee's termination and threatened legal action. But Sarah Chen was taking a completely different approach. Emma, do you think my appearance tells you everything about who I am? Sarah asked. No, ma'am. I realize now that it doesn't tell you anything important about a person. Sarah smiled slightly. You're partially right, but appearance can tell you things, just not the things you were looking for. She stood up slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. The restaurant had grown quieter as more people became aware of the conversation happening at the corner table. Sarah could feel dozens of eyes on her as she prepared to make her point. You saw a plain woman in a simple dress and decided I didn't belong here, Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed space. But you didn't really look, did you, Emma? The hostess shook her head, confused about what she was supposed to have seen. Sarah reached for the neckline of her dress, pulling it slightly to one side. What she revealed made Emma gasp audibly. There, on Sarah's shoulder, was the unmistakable eagle, globe, and anchor symbol of the United States Marine Corps. The tattoo was beautifully detailed, clearly the work of a skilled artist. But more than that, it was positioned prominently, not hidden away like a youthful mistake, but displayed with obvious pride. Below the Marine emblem was text that Emma could just make out, Semper Fidelis, and what appeared to be dates of service. The effect on everyone present was immediate and dramatic. Emma's hands flew to her mouth in shock. The manager's face went completely white. David whistled softly under his breath. He'd known Sarah for years, but had never seen the tattoo. Oh my God, Emma whispered. You're a Marine. Sarah adjusted her dress back into place, but the impact of the revelation rippled through the restaurant. Other diners who had been watching the scene began whispering among themselves, and those close enough to have seen the tattoo were sharing what they'd witnessed with others. I served 2 tours in Afghanistan, Sarah said simply. I was a combat engineer responsible for detecting and disarming explosive devices. I saved lives and I lost friends. I earned this tattoo through service to my country. The silence in the restaurant was profound. Emma looked like she might faint, the full weight of her misjudgment crashing down on her. She had dismissed a decorated Marine veteran as unworthy of basic respect. Marcus leaned forward, his voice filled with newfound respect for his colleague. Sarah, I had no idea you served. It's not something I advertise, Sarah replied. But it's part of who I am. Emma, when you looked at me tonight, you saw someone you thought was weak, insignificant, probably poor. What you actually saw was someone who volunteered to put her life on the line for strangers like you. Jennifer's eyes were bright with emotion. She'd worked with Sarah for 3 years and thought she knew her well. But this revelation added a completely new dimension to her understanding of her colleague's character. The discipline, the attention to detail, the calm under pressure that you see in the courtroom. David said slowly, connecting the dots. It all makes sense now, Sarah nodded. Military service teaches you things that stay with you forever. How to stay calm in chaos, how to work as part of a team, how to complete a mission no matter what obstacles you face. Emma was crying again, but these were different tears. Tears of shame and regret for her profound misjudgment. I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry. I dishonored your service. I dishonored you. You made a mistake, Sarah said firmly. But mistakes can be learned from. The question is, what will you do differently going forward? The manager found his voice, though it shook with emotion. Ms. Chen, I cannot begin to express how sorry I am. Not just as a business owner, but as an American. You served our country, and we failed to serve you with even basic courtesy. Other patrons in the restaurant had begun to stand, having caught pieces of the conversation and understanding that a veteran was present. The atmosphere had shifted completely from the dismissive treatment Sarah had received upon arrival. An elderly man at a nearby table approached hesitantly. Excuse me, ma'am. I couldn't help but overhear. I'm a Vietnam veteran myself. Thank you for your service. Sarah stood and shook his hand firmly. Thank you for yours, sir. The simple exchange sparked something in the restaurant. Other diners began to take notice, and the respect that should have been there from the beginning finally began to emerge. But it had taken the revelation of her military service to earn what should have been given freely to any customer. As word spread through the restaurant about the Marine veteran in their midst, the atmosphere continued to transform. What had begun as a few curious glances became something approaching reverence. Diners who had initially dismissed Sarah now looked at her with respect and shame. The elderly Vietnam veteran lingered by their table, clearly wanting to share his own story. "I know what it's like to come home and have people not understand," he said quietly to Sarah. "The service stays with you forever." Sarah nodded, understanding the unspoken connection between veterans. "It does, the good and the difficult parts both." Emma stood frozen, still processing the magnitude of her mistake. The woman she had dismissed as unworthy was not only a successful attorney but also a decorated veteran who had risked her life in service to the country. The weight of her misjudgment seemed to physically crush her spirits. "Ma'am," Emma said, her voice barely audible, "I need you to know that I understand now. I don't just mean about your military service, though that makes my behavior even worse. I mean about judging people at all. You could have been anyone, a teacher, a nurse, a mother, someone struggling financially, and you still would have deserved respect." Sarah studied the young woman's face, seeing genuine remorse and understanding. This was the moment she had been leading toward, not just recognition of her own accomplishments, but a deeper lesson about human dignity. That's exactly right, Emma. Every person who walks through that door deserves basic courtesy, regardless of their appearance or perceived status. The manager, who had been standing nearby wringing his hands, stepped forward. "Ms. Chen, I want to assure you that this will never happen again. We're going to implement new training protocols immediately." "What kind of training?" Jennifer asked, her lawyer instincts engaging. "Sensitivity training, diversity awareness, customer service excellence," the manager replied quickly. "Whatever it takes to ensure all our guests feel welcome." David raised an eyebrow. "That sounds like corporate speak." "What does it actually mean?" Sarah held up a hand before the conversation could become adversarial. "What it means is that change takes time and effort. Training is good, but real change comes from understanding why respect matters, not just being told to provide it." She turned back to Emma. "Tell me, what do you think you'll do differently tomorrow?" Emma took a deep breath, clearly thinking carefully about her answer. "I'll greet every guest the same way, regardless of how they look or dress. I'll remember that appearance doesn't tell you anything about someone's worth or their ability to pay. And I'll think about what I don't know about each person rather than what I think I know." "Good," Sarah said approvingly. "But there's something else you should consider." "What's that?" "Military service is just one of many ways people contribute to society. The next person you judge might be a teacher who shapes young minds, a caregiver who tends to the elderly, a volunteer who helps the homeless, or someone who's struggling but doing their best. Everyone has a story." Marcus watched this exchange with growing admiration for his colleague. He'd seen Sarah in action in courtrooms and boardrooms, but this display of leadership and teaching was something different. She was transforming a moment of humiliation into a learning experience. The elderly veteran had been listening to the conversation. "You know," he said to Emma, "when I came back from Vietnam, people weren't always kind to veterans. Sometimes they were downright hostile. But there were people like her who stood up for what was right, who saw past the uniform to the person underneath." Emma looked between Sarah and the older man, beginning to understand the broader implications of her behavior. "I never thought about it that way. I've been so focused on superficial things that I've missed what's actually important about people." A younger couple at a nearby table had been listening as well. The woman approached hesitantly. "Excuse me, I don't mean to interrupt, but I wanted to thank you for your service. And I have to say, watching how you've handled this situation has been incredible. You're teaching all of us something important." Sarah smiled graciously. "Thank you. But the real lesson isn't about me. It's about how we treat each other every day." The restaurant manager seized the moment to interject. "Ms. Chen, I'd like to offer you and your colleagues our finest table and our chef's special menu. Completely complimentary, of course." Sarah looked around at her colleagues, then back at the manager.
"I appreciate the offer, but what I'd really like is for this to be a learning experience for everyone."
Keep the table we have, but treat your next customer who doesn't look wealthy exactly the same way you'd treat someone in an expensive suit." The manager nodded vigorously. "Absolutely. You have my word." Jennifer leaned forward with a slight smile. "Sarah, you realize you've probably just revolutionized customer service at this restaurant?" "One conversation at a time," Sarah replied with a chuckle. Emma had been standing silently, absorbing everything she'd heard. Finally, she spoke up again. "Ms. Chen, may I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Why did you join the Marines?" "I mean, with your intelligence and education, you could have done anything." Sarah considered the question thoughtfully. "I joined because I believed in service to something larger than myself. The Marines taught me that your worth isn't measured by what you have or how you look, but by what you do and how you treat others." David nodded appreciatively. "That explains a lot about how you approach your legal work. You don't just take the high-profile cases that will make you famous. You take the cases that matter. Every case matters to the people involved," Sarah replied simply. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their server, a young man who had clearly been briefed on the situation. His demeanor was completely different from the dismissive treatment Sarah had received earlier. "Good evening," he said respectfully. "I'm James, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. I want to personally apologize for any poor service you may have received earlier." Sarah studied his face, seeing genuine sincerity. "Thank you, James. What matters now is how we move forward." As they finally began to focus on their dinner, the conversation around the table shifted to lighter topics. But the impact of the evening's events continued to ripple through the restaurant. Other diners approached throughout the meal to thank Sarah for her service, or to share their own stories of military family members. Emma returned to her hostess station, but she was clearly changed by the encounter. Sarah could see her greeting each new arrival with careful attention and genuine warmth, regardless of their appearance. "You know," Marcus said as they reviewed their menus, "I've worked with you for 5 years and I thought I knew you pretty well. But tonight I've learned more about who you are than in all our previous conversations combined." Sarah smiled at her colleague. "We all carry parts of ourselves that don't show on the surface. The key is not making assumptions about what we can't see." As the evening progressed, the restaurant transformed into something resembling a community gathering. Word had spread beyond their table about the Marine veteran who had been mistreated, and several other veterans in the restaurant had quietly identified themselves to Sarah. A middle-aged woman approached during their main course, her husband following behind her. "Excuse me," she said to Sarah. "My father served in Korea and my son just deployed to Japan. I wanted to thank you for your service, but also for how you've handled this situation. You've shown more grace than most people would." Sarah stood to shake their hands. "Thank you. Please tell your son that his service matters." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "I will, and I have to tell you, watching what happened here tonight has made me think about my own assumptions. I work in human resources, and I'm going to share this story with my team." After they returned to their seats, Jennifer leaned over to Sarah. "Do you realize you've accidentally become a teacher for this entire restaurant?" "Not accidentally," David interjected. "This is classic Sarah. She sees teaching moments everywhere." Sarah considered this observation while cutting her fish. "The military teaches you that every action has consequences." Tonight, Emma's actions had consequences she never considered. "But my response will have consequences too. The question is whether those consequences help people grow or just make them feel small." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "That's why you didn't just demand an apology and leave. You wanted to create change, not just prove a point." "Exactly. Anyone can make someone feel bad about their mistakes. It takes more effort to help them understand why the mistake matters and how to do better." James, their server, returned to check on their meals. His service had been impeccable all evening, clearly influenced by the earlier events. "How is everything? Can I get you anything else?" "Actually, yes," Sarah said. "Could you ask Emma to come over when she has a moment? I'd like to speak with her again." James nodded and hurried away. A few minutes later, Emma approached their table nervously, clearly unsure what to expect. "You wanted to see me, Miss Chen?" Sarah gestured to an empty chair. "Please sit for a moment. I wanted to ask how you're feeling about everything that's happened tonight." Emma sat carefully, her posture showing both respect and lingering embarrassment. "Honestly, I feel terrible about how I treated you. But I also feel like I learned something important." I've been watching myself with other customers tonight and I realize how many assumptions I was making without even knowing it. That's good self-awareness, Sarah said approvingly. Can you give me an example? Well, there was a young man who came in wearing work clothes, paint on his shirt, dusty boots. My first instinct was to think he probably couldn't afford much. But then I caught myself and realized I had no idea who he was or what his situation might be. It turned out he was a contractor who'd just finished a job and wanted to celebrate signing a big contract. Jennifer smiled. So you treated him well regardless of your first impression? I did, and he was so appreciative of the good service. He even asked for my name so he could mention it in his review. Emma paused, then added quietly, I wonder how many people I've made feel unwelcome without even realizing it. David leaned forward. The fact that you're wondering about that means you're already changing. Sarah nodded. Emma, I want to tell you something about leadership. Real leaders aren't the people who never make mistakes. They're the people who learn from their mistakes and help others learn too. Are you saying I could be a leader someday? Emma asked, surprise evident in her voice. I'm saying you're already showing leadership qualities by being willing to examine your own behavior and change it. That's harder than most people think. The manager had been hovering nearby, clearly wanting to join the conversation. Sarah noticed him and gestured for him to approach. How are things going, Emma? He asked, his tone much warmer than when the evening had begun. She's doing excellent work, Sarah answered before Emma could respond. She's turned this into a learning experience not just for herself but for other staff members as well. The manager looked surprised. Really? Emma nodded eagerly. I've been sharing what I learned with the other hosts and servers. We're all talking about how to better serve customers regardless of how they look. That's exactly the kind of initiative we need, the manager said, clearly pleased. Emma, I think this experience might qualify you for our leadership development program. Emma's face lit up with surprise and gratitude. Really? You're not going to fire me? Fire you? You've shown more growth in one evening than most employees show in months. Ms. Chen has helped you turn a serious mistake into a valuable lesson. Sarah watched this exchange with satisfaction. This was what she had hoped for. Not punishment, but transformation. Emma would be a better employee and a better person because of tonight's experience. An older gentleman at the next table had been listening to their conversation. He approached hesitantly, waiting for a pause in their discussion. Forgive me for eavesdropping, he said, but I'm a retired teacher, and what I've witnessed here tonight is some of the best education I've ever seen. Young lady, he said to Emma, you're lucky to have crossed paths with someone who believes in teaching rather than just correcting. Emma looked at Sarah with newfound understanding. You really are a teacher, aren't you? Not just a lawyer. We're all teachers, Sarah replied. Every interaction we have teaches someone something. The question is what we choose to teach. The evening was drawing to a close, but the impact of their conversation continued to spread through the restaurant. Sarah noticed that the staff was treating all customers with increased attention and respect. Her colleagues had watched the transformation with fascination and growing respect for her leadership style. Sarah, Marcus said as they prepared to leave, I've seen you win cases that other lawyers said were impossible. But what you did tonight might be even more impressive. Why do you say that? Because changing someone's mind in a courtroom is one thing. Changing someone's heart in a restaurant is something else entirely. Sarah smiled as she gathered her purse. The heart and the mind aren't as separate as people think. When you help someone understand why something matters, the heart follows naturally. As they stood to leave, Emma approached one final time. Ms. Chen, I know I don't have the right to ask this, but would it be okay if I stayed in touch? I'd like to let you know how I'm doing with everything I learned tonight. Sarah considered the request thoughtfully. I think that would be wonderful, Emma. Growth is a process, not a single moment. Emma pulled out her phone. Could I get your email address? I promise I won't bother you often, but I'd like to update you on how I'm applying what you taught me. Of course. Sarah shared her contact information, then added, and Emma, don't be afraid to share your story with others. Sometimes the best teachers are the people who've learned from their own mistakes. The manager stepped forward as they prepared to leave. Ms. Chen, I hope you'll consider returning. And please know that tonight has changed how we operate. We're implementing new policies based on what happened here. What kind of policies? Jennifer asked, her legal training making her curious about specifics. Every new employee will hear about tonight during orientation, not to shame anyone, but to help them understand that service means serving everyone equally. We're also creating a feedback system so customers can let us know when we fall short." David nodded approvingly. "That sounds like genuine systemic change, not just surface-level adjustments." Sarah shook the manager's hand. "I appreciate your commitment to improvement. Real change takes ongoing effort, not just good intentions." As they walked toward the exit, several other diners nodded respectfully to Sarah. The elderly Vietnam veteran saluted her quietly, a gesture she returned with equal solemnity. The atmosphere in the restaurant had completely transformed from the dismissive environment she'd encountered upon arrival. Outside the restaurant, Sarah's colleagues continued discussing the evening's events. The celebration of her legal victory had become something much more significant, a masterclass in leadership and human dignity. "I have to ask," Marcus said as they waited for their cars, "how often does something like this happen to you?" Sarah considered the question. "More often than you might think. People make assumptions based on appearance all the time. Usually I just ignore it and move on." "What made tonight different?" Jennifer asked. "You were here," Sarah replied simply. "It became an opportunity to teach instead of just endure." David shook his head in amazement. Most people would have been furious. They would have demanded apologies, threatened lawsuits, made a scene. Instead, you turned it into a learning experience for everyone involved. Sarah looked back at the restaurant, where she could see Emma greeting new customers with careful attention and genuine warmth. Anger might have made me feel better in the moment, but it wouldn't have changed anything. Emma will remember tonight for the rest of her life, and hopefully, she'll treat people differently because of it. "You realize word of this is going to spread beyond just this restaurant," Marcus pointed out. "Emma will tell her friends, the manager will share it with other restaurant owners. The customers tonight will talk about it." "You've started something bigger than just one conversation." Sarah smiled. "That's the hope. Change spreads one person at a time, one conversation at a time." As they parted ways, her colleagues couldn't stop talking about what they'd witnessed. They'd known Sarah as a brilliant lawyer, but tonight they'd seen her as something more. A leader who understood that true strength sometimes means choosing compassion over confrontation, teaching over punishment. 3 weeks later, Sarah received an email that made her smile. It was from Emma with the subject line, "Update from a grateful student." "Dear Ms. Chen," it began, "I wanted to share what's happened since that night at the restaurant. First, I was accepted into the leadership development program, and I've been promoted to assistant manager. But more importantly, I've been sharing your lesson with everyone I meet. Last week, a homeless man came into the restaurant asking if we had any leftover food. The old me might have turned him away immediately. Instead, I remembered what you taught me about not making assumptions. I sat down and talked with him. It turns out he's a veteran too, Vietnam era, who's been struggling since his wife died. Not only did we give him a meal, but I connected him with veteran services in the area. Yesterday, he came back to thank me. He's gotten temporary housing and is working with counselors. He told me that being treated with dignity that day was the first step in believing he deserved better. I thought you'd want to know that your lesson is still teaching people." Sarah forwarded the email to her colleagues, then picked up her phone to call Emma directly. "Emma, it's Sarah Chen. I just read your email, and I'm incredibly proud of how you've grown." "Ms. Chen, I can't believe you called. Did I do the right thing with the homeless veteran?" "You did exactly the right thing. You saw a person instead of a stereotype, and you acted with compassion. That's leadership. I keep thinking about that night and how different my life might be if you hadn't been so patient with me. I could have been fired, blacklisted from the industry, publicly shamed. Instead, you gave me a chance to become better." Sarah settled back in her office chair, looking out at the city skyline. "Emma, can I share something with you? That tattoo you saw, it represents more than just my military service. It represents a commitment to values that don't end when you take off the uniform. Courage, honor, commitment. They're not just military values, they're human values. I never thought about it that way. The courage to treat people with dignity when others don't. The honor to do what's right even when no one's watching. The commitment to keep learning and growing even when it's uncomfortable." Emma was quiet for a moment. "I want to live up to those values too, not just at work but everywhere. You're already doing that. The homeless veteran you helped, that took courage. seeing past his appearance to his humanity. That took honor. Continuing to apply these lessons weeks later, that's commitment. After ending the call, Sarah reflected on how the ripple effects of that evening continued to spread. Her assistant knocked on her door, interrupting her thoughts. "Sarah, there's someone here to see you. He says it's about the restaurant incident a few weeks ago." Curious, Sarah agreed to see the visitor. To her surprise, it was the elderly Vietnam veteran from the restaurant, now dressed in a crisp suit and carrying a folder. "Ms. Chen, I hope you remember me. Robert Martinez from Meridian Restaurant." "Of course, Mr. Martinez. Please sit down. What brings you here?" Robert opened his folder and pulled out several newspaper clippings. "I'm a retired journalist, and what happened that night stuck with me. I've been doing some research on you, your military service, your legal work, your pro bono cases. With your permission, I'd like to write a story about it." Sarah examined the clippings, seeing her name in headlines about various cases she'd won. "What angle are you thinking of taking?" "The story isn't really about the restaurant incident," Robert explained. "It's about invisible service. You're a combat veteran who's been protecting people in courtrooms the same way you protected them overseas. But people don't see it because you don't fit their image of what a hero looks like." Sarah leaned back, considering his proposal. "I'm not comfortable being called a hero, Mr. Martinez. That's exactly what makes the story worth telling. Real heroes rarely see themselves that way." Robert leaned forward, his journalist instincts engaged. How many other people are out there serving their communities in ways that go unrecognized because they don't look the part? "What would you want from me for this story?" "An interview about your transition from military to legal service, how the values you learned as a Marine influence your work as a lawyer, and maybe some thoughts on why we judge people based on appearance instead of character." Sarah considered the request carefully. She'd always preferred to work quietly, avoiding publicity. But Robert's approach intrigued her, focusing on the broader issue rather than just her personal story. "I'll do the interview on one condition," she said finally. "Include Emma's story too. Show how people can learn and change when given the opportunity." Robert's eyes lit up. "That's brilliant. The complete arc, the misjudgment, the revelation, the learning, and the ongoing change. It becomes a story about redemption as much as recognition." They scheduled the interview for the following week. As Robert prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Ms. Chen, can I ask you something personal? That night at the restaurant, you could have destroyed that young woman's career with a few words. What made you choose the harder path of teaching her?" Sarah thought about the question. "In the Marines, we learned that breaking something is always easier than building it. I could have broken Emma that night, her confidence, her job, her future. But building her into someone better served everyone more." "Including you?" Sarah smiled. "Especially me. Helping someone grow is more satisfying than proving you're better than them." Robert nodded appreciatively. "That's going to be the heart of the story." After he left, Sarah returned to her work, but her mind kept drifting to the conversation. She thought about all the other veterans who served quietly in civilian careers, using the values they'd learned in uniform to make their communities better. Teachers who brought military discipline to unruly classrooms. Firefighters who applied combat teamwork to emergency situations. Business leaders who used military ethics to guide their decisions. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Jennifer. "Just heard from Marcus that you're being interviewed for a newspaper story. About time your work gets recognized." Sarah texted back. "It's not about recognition. It's about showing people that service takes many forms." Jennifer's response came quickly. "Same thing, different words. You've been serving all along. Most people just couldn't see it." As Sarah looked at her reflection in her office window, she thought about the layers of identity people carry. The lawyer, the veteran, the teacher, the advocate. How many people walk through the world carrying invisible badges of service, unrecognized because they didn't fit expected stereotypes? Her assistant buzzed her intercom. "Sarah, Emma from Meridian Restaurant is online too. She says it's important." Sarah picked up the phone, curious about what had prompted another call so soon. "Ms. Chen, I hope I'm not bothering you, but something amazing just happened, and I wanted to share it with you immediately." Sarah leaned back in her chair, intrigued by Emma's excitement. "What happened?" "A group of restaurant managers from across the city came in today for a meeting. They'd heard about what happened that night and wanted to learn from our experience. They're implementing similar training programs at their restaurants based on what I shared about our conversation." Sarah felt a warm sense of satisfaction. That's wonderful, Emma. How did that make you feel? Incredible. I was telling them about how you taught me to see people differently, and one of them said something that really stuck with me. He said, "It sounds like she didn't just change how you treat customers, she changed how you see the world." Is that true? Sarah asked gently. Emma's voice grew thoughtful. It really is. I catch myself in other situations now, at the grocery store, on the bus, walking down the street, and I realize I'm making the same kinds of assumptions I made about you. But now I stop myself and think about what I don't know about each person I see. Sarah smiled, remembering her own journey of learning to see beyond surfaces. That awareness is the beginning of wisdom, Emma. There's something else, Emma continued. The homeless veteran I told you about, Robert, he's gotten a job. Part-time at first, but it's a start. He came by yesterday to thank me again, and he said something that made me cry. What did he say? He said that night when I treated him like a human being instead of a problem to be solved, it reminded him that he was still worth something. That dignity you showed me, I was able to pass it on to someone else who desperately needed it. Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. This was exactly what she had hoped for. Not just individual change, but a ripple effect of compassion spreading outward. Emma, do you understand what you've done? You've taken a painful lesson and transformed it into a gift for others. That takes real courage. I learned from watching you. You could have used your power to hurt me, but instead you used it to help me grow. Now I'm trying to do the same thing with others. After ending the call, Sarah sat quietly for a few minutes, processing the full impact of that evening 3 weeks ago. What had started as a simple dinner celebration had become something much larger. A lesson in leadership, dignity, and the power of choosing growth over punishment. Her phone rang again. This time it was Robert Martinez, the journalist. Ms. Chen, I hope you don't mind another call, but I've been doing more research for our interview, and I've discovered something fascinating. What's that? I've been talking to other people who've had similar experiences. Veterans, particularly women veterans who've been underestimated or dismissed based on their appearance. Your story isn't unique, but your response to it might be. Sarah was intrigued. How so? Most people in similar situations either get angry and make a scene, or they quietly endure it and move on. You found a third option, turning it into a teaching moment. I'm finding other examples of you doing this throughout your career, such as the Morrison environmental case. Instead of just winning a settlement and walking away, you worked with the company to implement better practices. The Henderson custody battle, you helped the divorcing parents develop a co-parenting plan that protected the children. Even your pro bono work with veterans, you don't just win their cases, you connect them with ongoing support services. Sarah realized Robert had done extensive research. I suppose I do tend to look for solutions that help everyone involved. That's exactly what I mean. You consistently choose the harder path that leads to lasting change rather than the easier path that just solves the immediate problem. Robert paused, then continued. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I have a theory. Your military service didn't just teach you tactics and discipline. It taught you to think strategically about long-term objectives versus short-term victories. Sarah found herself nodding, even though Robert couldn't see her. That's perceptive. In the military, you learn that winning a battle isn't the same as winning a war. Sometimes you have to sacrifice immediate gratification for a larger goal. And that night at the restaurant, your larger goal was changing hearts and minds, not just getting an apology. Exactly. An apology would have made me feel better temporarily, but it wouldn't have prevented the next person from being treated the same way. Robert's excitement was evident in his voice. This is going to be a powerful story, Ms. Chen. With your permission, I'd like to expand it beyond just the restaurant incident. I want to explore this pattern of choosing transformative solutions over punitive ones. Sarah considered this carefully. She'd always avoided publicity, preferring to work quietly behind the scenes, but she was beginning to see the potential impact of sharing her approach more broadly. What would that look like? A series of articles, actually, starting with the restaurant story, but expanding to show how military values can be applied to civilian challenges. How the discipline to choose the harder right over the easier wrong can transform communities. Sarah made her decision. Yes, I'll do it. But I have conditions. Name them. First, this isn't about me personally. It's about the values and the approach. Second, we include voices from other people who've been part of these situations. Emma, your fellow veteran Robert, Maybe some of my legal clients who are willing to share their experiences. Absolutely. What else? Third, we focus on practical applications. I don't want this to be just feel-good stories. I want readers to walk away with specific ideas about how they can apply these principles in their own lives. Robert was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking. You know what this could become? A blueprint for leadership that's based on service rather than authority. The military teaches you to lead by example and to take care of your people. You've been applying those principles in civilian life. Sarah felt a sense of rightness about the direction their conversation was taking. I've never thought of it in those terms, but you might be right. Ms. Chen, I think this story could inspire other veterans who are struggling with how to translate their military experience into civilian impact. And it could help civilians understand that heroism isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, consistent service. As they finalized plans for the interview series, Sarah reflected on the unexpected journey that had begun with a simple dinner reservation. What had started as an evening of celebration had become a moment of teaching, which had grown into a story of transformation, and was now evolving into a platform for broader change. Her military service had taught her that every mission starts with a single step, but success is measured by the final objective achieved. That night at the restaurant, her objective hadn't been personal vindication. It had been human growth and understanding. Now, weeks later, she could see the mission's success in Emma's continued growth. In the veteran who had found housing and hope, in the restaurant managers implementing new training programs, and in the story that would soon reach even more people. Sarah smiled as she looked at the Marine Corps emblem on her desk, a reminder not of past service, but of ongoing commitment. The uniform might be in her closet now, but the values it represented continued to guide every decision she made. Service, she reflected, wasn't something you did for a specific period of time. It was a way of living, a choice to use whatever skills and opportunities you had to make the world a little better than you found it. The revelation of her tattoo that night had been just that, a revelation. Not of who she used to be, but of who she had always been and would continue to be. A Marine, a lawyer, a teacher, a citizen, all of them united by the simple commitment to serve others with honor, courage, and compassion.